the character in this book is a genetically engineered female soldier, U.S. soldier. And I got to tell you, writing this book from that perspective was difficult for me. Well, I'm obviously not a woman, so I really had to try my best, and that's about all I can claim there. And if I got it wrong, I'm sorry. And the second difficulty with writing from this perspective was that it's a genetically engineered human being. It's not a person like you and me. She has limited experiences. She's grown in a tank. These soldiers are treated more or less like military hardware. They're all the same because that makes them easier to maintain in the field. Field maintenance consists of psychological evaluations after every action, administration of psychotropic drugs, those sorts of things. There's a series of videos that Jeremy Tolbert put together for these books that actually has an interview with one of the psychologists on the project, a mock interview, at www.subterrenewar.com, and it's a pretty interesting look at some of the characters that don't appear in the book necessarily. So that's what you're dealing with when you're dealing with, her name is Catherine. I'm starting at chapter 4, and she has just, she's a lesbian, and her girlfriend has just gotten killed in their attempt to escape service, U.S. service in the military. Catherine gets captured by Russian soldiers. The war is between Russian and U.S. forces. So Catherine wakes up. She's been captured by Russian soldiers. She's just remembering that she's lost the woman she loves, Megan, and we'll go from there. And I'm going to apologize. These Russian genetics, they use some terms that might be offensive to Jewish people, and I don't want to offend anybody who reads this book. I contemplated this particular passage when I wrote it, and I thought, well, you know what? These guys, these Russian soldiers, are just like the American ones in that they're not taught a lot, and what they're taught comes from a Russian perspective, and sometimes the Russians are now I'm going to offend Russians if there's anybody.
Hey,
I can't win. Okay, I can't win.
Doubly offended.
I don't share the viewpoints in here. I just, wrote what I thought these particular characters would think or say or do at the particular time. And if you are offended, please come up and tell me. I can take it, and I'll apologize 1,000 times. And I hope this works. But anyway, so she's just coming to. And each chapter starts with a passage from their modern combat manual, which is essentially a corruption of the Bible. And when I take it, sometimes it jumps back and forth with flashbacks. If I stop and take a drink, that means you're about to change potentially from present to past or whatever. For it will come to pass that some of you may find yourself cut off from him, and at that moment you will be lost forever to wander alone. Death delivers. Modern Combat Manual, Joshua 22:11. The first things I noticed were whistles. One was low, a single tone that I had heard before, but which didn't register as a train whistle until I noticed the clanking of wheels beneath me, the shaking of a rail car. But there were other whistles, high-pitched ones. And although cold drafts pushed up through the carriage floorboards, what I eventually determined was music brushed the chill aside with a tune that disturbed and comforted simultaneously. The song was sad. Someone whispered into my ear afterward, and his plucking a fiddle as he spoke made me smile. Cherny Voron, Diedushka, a little music for death, the only warm place in winter. We've all seen the raven, but many none so closely as you, and it's supposed to be spring, and yet everyone freezes in this crappy rail car. 100 years ago, and Russia would have been thawed, but now winter lasts 6 months, sometimes 8, and the non-bred all wish for those days when warming was a threat. Let me tell you something else. But before he finished, pain rushed upward from my legs, forcing me back into unconsciousness. Who knew how much time passed before I finally woke? When I did, the sight of them didn't shock me. To the contrary, it made me feel secure. These were Russian genetics. The wounded and maimed and the dying may be at the end of their service term. All of them were boys about the same age as me, and when my eyes opened to see how we had been arranged in bunks stacked to the ceiling with about half a meter of space that left barely enough room to breathe, and with hot vents doing their best to keep the chill off, it felt safe in an inevitable sort of way. If they killed me, so what? The Amu Darya had already taken Megan. so that whatever existence remained was more than I should have been allowed, more than I wanted, since it would be spent alone, and my desire to run had vanished. Death would be a way to join her. The music had gone, but when they saw me awake, they all shouted something, those that were conscious, and then laughed, one of them leaning down from the bunk above to offer a cigarette, an act of kindness that I never would have expected. "I don't smoke," I said, but he insisted, and so I took it and inhaled, coughing to the point where the pain in my lungs revived, reminding me of what had happened. I started crying. Of course they were happy. These ones still had their families. Someone said something, but then another cut him off. "She speaks English, only English, so be fucking polite for once. Play her another song." "Brodiaga." A number of the boys had groaned, and the one above me spoke up. "Not that one again. Play us something really strange, that Jew song, the one you played a long time ago." The boys hushed then, and I heard several of them get off their bunks to sit on the floor next to me, and a few seconds later another song filled the rail car. I had to look. They grinned as they played, 5 boys, as identical to each other as Megan and I had been, and so I asked, because they had gone to the trouble to play, "What song is that?" "The Jew song," the one above me said. I shook my head. "No, I mean, what is its name?" "That's what I said, the Jew song. We don't know its name, so we call it that, and none of us even know what a Jew is. It's as good a name as any other, so who cares about a name? Do you have a name?" "Catherine." "Katerina," he asked. The song stopped then, and at first I thought I'd said something wrong, but when a discussion broke out in Russian, but then the boys with instruments arranged themselves again, preparing. "Not Catherine, not on this trip. While you're with us, your name is Katyusha." Everyone screamed, "Katyusha!" and the boys played a new song, faster than the last. The boy above me leaned over and smiled. Now I saw that his left hand was severed at the wrist, the wound still open and raw, but without losing blood, and many of his teeth had broken to make his grin a jagged but friendly one. Katyusha is an old song, very old. The first one we learn in training. It's about a girl who sends her lover off to war and promises to wait for his return. "Why are you being..." I searched for the right word but couldn't find it. "Why am I alive?" "Why haven't we killed you?" I nodded. "Orders. We found you on the riverbank in Darganata, where we had been sent to scout American movements in Uzbekistan, across the river. The American specials came and didn't know we were there. They were looking for you, and so we let them have it, but they called in an airstrike, which is when we all got wounded. The doctor took care of you while you were out, and your wounds aren't bad, a few flechette hits. But we know what happens to you after 2 years and more. He says you're dying anyway, so why should we go to all the trouble of killing you when nature will handle it soon herself? Besides, we've been told to take as many of our sisters alive whenever we can." Orders. If it were possible, his grin got even wider, so wide that it made me forget my legs. I said, "We assumed all of you hated us." "Why?" "Because we're enemies." "That's the difference between you and us, the American synthetics and the Russian ones. We don't have enemies. We have only missions. It's just a job, Katyusha. Some of us might hate you, but most of us don't care about those we kill, and when you think of it, we both have the same mission, the same parents. Hatred amidst all that is just too tiring." My limbs went slack, and the cigarette fell to the floor in a shower of sparks as another wave of exhaustion hit, forcing the room to go dark. The last thing I heard was the boy. Hatred is an obscurant. My dreams traced a path of hatred. Time and repetition should have illuminated its genesis sooner, but I suspected that constant fatigue had kept me blind, or maybe there was something about being wounded that clarified it, brought the reasons for my hatred into focus. Whatever the reason, they came. Faces, Marines with whom my unit had always been attached, and their thousands of expressions played out in my subconscious, laughing, and I couldn't blame them for it, wondering at my own stupidity and that of my sisters, especially of Megan and the Lilies, for having served without question. There was the Marine leaning out of the APC and waving goodbye. "See ya, bitches," just before the image faded, transformed into another where a supply depot near the town of Yangyul stretched out as far as we could see, the detritus of war mingled with the lifeblood of its participants. Piles of crates and shipping containers formed massive square structures. In places, these had been hit by enemy air attacks, and cranes moved in to salvage the containers that were intact, discarded those beyond salvage, which, sometimes when lifted, spewed their contents, usually helmets, rations, or spare parts, onto the ground like a bursting piñata. On the northern side of the depot, 3 massive portals lay open, dark. The entrances led to tunnels so wide that vehicles could pass in either direction for frontline supply runs, but one of them had been targeted, its mouth filled with concrete rubble that I saw, when I zoomed in, also held mangled bodies of those unfortunate enough to have been caught in the blast. Yanguyul was a wreck, I realized. Marines scrambled over rubble and slid down into plasma craters while we climbed from the flat cars, and from the open platform we could see more of what remained of the Tashkent-Shymkent sector's main depot. Point defense towers lay flat on the ground where an aborted Russian advance had destroyed them, and new towers stretched upward. When Russian drones approached, there wasn't an alarm. Instead, almost as soon as we had assembled, the Yanguyul plasma defenses thumped like a chorus of timpanis, and Marines sprinted to any cover they could, rubble, bomb shelters at the bottoms of craters. We just stood there. Then we shrugged when the drones and missiles never came, having been driven off by defensive fire. After the all clear, a group of men closest to us complained of the heat, but they returned to their work, lifting sections of magnetic containment coils to place them on cargo crawlers, huge flatbed-tracked vehicles that artillery units used to transport reactor equipment, which would provide power and deuterium for our plasma cannons. The coil pipes were flexible ceramic and alloy tubes, roughly 1 meter across, about a metric ton per section, and would line narrow rock channels that had been drilled from the rear into our main underground positions. That way, if the enemy took a section of our line, artillery units could pipe super-hot gas into our abandoned tunnel. Many Russians had been cooked this way. The coils themselves would be electrified, creating a charge that prevented the gas from making contact with the pipe walls, ensuring that the plasma was still hot when it arrived. The men moving the coil pipes didn't actually do any lifting, but merely had to guide them to make sure they didn't rotate out of alignment as the crawler's crane carefully lowered them to its deck. Our orders had not yet arrived, so Megan and the rest of us squatted on the platform to watch the work. We had been there almost an hour when it happened. "McTier," an officer shouted, "get out from under the coil pipe." The man shuffled out and waved, "Sorry." "Listen up." The officer stood at the bottom of a crater and observed as they loaded the last section onto a carrier at the crater's lip above him. "When you're done with this one, you can have a half-hour break. Chow's inside entrance 4. The Marines gave a half-hearted cheer, and the one named McTier rested his hands on the nearby coil and pushed, his expression turning immediately into one of horror. "Sugar, get out of the way, it's swinging wide." But the warning came too late. The section was on its way down and started to rotate in the direction of another man, who stood on the edge of the flatbed. His back was to the coil, and he stared off with a blank expression as if he didn't hear the shouts, "Get out of the way." Before it could strike him, the section straps snapped, and the thing crashed against the edge of the carrier, catapulting the man, Shugart, 20 meters into the rubble. His officer, who had begun his way up the crater, stopped to look. 3 coil sections tumbled off the carrier and slid down the sloping side of the pit in slow motion, rolling over him, before they stopped with a groan. He never had time to scream. A smear that looked like raspberry jam had been wiped against the glassy crater side, all that remained of the officer, a message spelled out in dead tissue that war could touch you anywhere, any time. Even the rear could be a dangerous place. "Corpsman," one of them yelled. What would a corpsman do, I wondered, glancing at Megan. You could see she was thinking the same thing. Someone fucking do something, goddammit. The Marine named McTier slid to the bottom of the crater and pulled at the edge of one of the pipes, a tiny pool of blood collecting next to his boots, as Shugart stood to shake his head clear. Someone said, "Get out of there, McTier, he's gone. The coils might shift again." But none of the other Marines moved except for Shugart. He had finished dusting himself off and started sobbing. Eventually, after he dropped to his knees, the sergeant arrived and the men began the slow process of pulling out the sections one by one until they reached the officer, who had been crushed so badly that all that remained was a pile of ceramic shards, meat, and intestines, collected in a pool of blood at the crater base. I zoomed into it, fascinated by the realization that on the inside we looked the same. McTier saw me watching. "What the hell are you looking at?"